This photo is from the time in the early 20th century when the world was in the process of losing its collective mind. It was 1936 in Hamburg, Germany, when Germans were being taught to salute Hitler with the call to Sieg Heil, or Hail Victory. But we see in this throng of enthusiastic Germans this one lone figure who's having none of it. Auguste Landmesser. He was a German, he was a mechanic, but he was in love with a Jewish woman. And he intended to marry her and to have family with her. Now, he and Irma Eckler did have 2 daughters, though they were not legally allowed to marry. Eventually, August was imprisoned, later forced to serve in the military, where he was killed. Irma was sent to a concentration camp where she was killed. Their 2 daughters survived. One went into foster care. One was raised by a grandmother. In 1951, years after both were dead, the German government formally recognized their marriage, as Germany was beginning to come to terms with what they had done. Now, it's hard to believe sometimes that things like this were going on in the world, not in ancient Rome. This was not the conquistadores in South America. These were our relatives, and this happened within the memory, not of those of us here in the room, but certainly of our parents. How did we begin to change all of that? How did the world get that crazy? And we began to turn away from the madness of prejudice and racism, of anti-Semitism, and this kind of discrimination. We all know enough about history to know that it didn't change in a straight line, did it? There were people like Auguste Landmesser who saw how wrong it all was. And even though he was surrounded by co-workers, relatives, neighbors who believed differently, sometimes one person armed with the truth becomes a majority. Now, we're all liberals living in a very red state. In fact, we might be all of the liberals living in a very red state. I have noticed when I get invited to go speak, almost always, my next sojourn is to Bowling Green, Kentucky, and then Houston, Texas, and Dallas, and a delightful little church in West Texas. Then South Carolina. I never get invited to liberal bastions. I always get invited to places where people feel like they're Auguste Landmesser, standing in a crowd of people that have all gone crazy. That sounds like a hard word, doesn't it? But they are all of a different perspective, and you've decided that you're going to be against the grain. You've heard me say many times that only dead fish always swim with the current, that you have to swim against the current. My good friend Andrew says that his image of me is of a salmon swimming upstream, jumping straight into the jaws of a bear. I don't know how to thank you for that, Andrew, but it does feel that way a lot of the time. But lest we convince ourselves that the Germans were the evil empire and that America saved the world, you should remember that in 1939, there was a great deal of sympathy for the fascist party in the United States. This is a photograph from February 20, 1939, when 20,000 Americans crowded into Madison Square Garden and gave the Nazi salute to a large banner of George Washington. Now, there were 100,000 people outside of Madison Square Garden that were protesting this anti-Semitic gathering, and that's helpful in a way, but there were 20,000 people in Madison Square Garden enthusiastic about the rise of Nazism. my now deceased former father-in-law, fought in Europe in World War II. He never tired of telling war stories, but in between his tales of wartime hijinks were affirmations of how much he hated black people, how much he hated Jews, and how much he hated communists. And he used the word communist. What he meant was Democrats, but he knew I was one, so he would say communists. And I finally asked him, after several years of having to sit through these tirades, why did you fight against the Nazis when you agreed with everything that they stood for? For which there was not a really good answer, right? Because really, an awful lot of America, given the option, were sympathetic with what the Nazis stood for. And so we recruited soldiers out of the Midwest by telling them that Nazis were going to come and rape our women, or that they were eating children. We came up with these posters of the Japanese that had monkey ears and tails because their racist, fascist views were certainly not unfamiliar, particularly in the part of the world that I'm from, in Kentucky, and in some ways it's gotten worse. I mean, we can talk about how Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul are two of the worst senators that have ever lived, but they keep getting reelected by my people, my cousins, my relatives in Kentucky. And so how far can you say that you are away from producing that? In many ways, Mitch McConnell effectively represents the way that people in my home state think. Now, Roosevelt took us into World War II, and I'm not a great student of American history, and if you're a better student of American history than I am, please don't ruin my recording by contradicting me immediately. But Roosevelt took us into World War II, but given some of the veterans that I've known from that era, we can be thankful that he did not take us into the war on the side of the Nazis, because there was a lot of that sentiment in the White House. I've been listening to parts of a new biography about the life of Eleanor Roosevelt by the historian Blanche Cook. Eleanor was the First Lady of the United States from 1933 until her husband's death in his fourth term as president. Of things we can be thankful for, we now have a constitutional amendment that's two. Two is it. But he was in his fourth term as president, died in 1945, right at the end of the war. After he died, Eleanor was actually appointed to be our ambassador to the newly formed United Nations. Now, the relationship between Eleanor and Franklin was complicated, to say the very least. They were distant cousins who fell in love and decided to get married against family sentiment, but they did it. But almost immediately, Franklin had an affair with his secretary, and when he returned from a trip with her once, Eleanor was unpacking his suitcase and found their love letters, and it literally crushed her heart. So they both wanted to divorce, but they were Roosevelts, and in those days, Roosevelts didn't divorce, so their family insisted that they stay together. But they didn't stay together so much as husband and wife as they did as a political partnership. I think we've seen that in recent history as well. I think some powerful couples end up with not much romance or intimacy, but a great deal of power sharing and collusion. They both had their paramours, but they worked together through the war years to help give birth to what we have enjoyed as the modern world. The Germans were working to exterminate the Jews, but as I've said, the Americans were not working terribly hard to protect the Jews. Again, in 1939, a ship with nearly 1,000 Jewish refugees trying to escape the Holocaust was turned away from American shores and sent back to Germany. And they literally came up to New Jersey and went down the coast, and we had Coast Guard ships following it to be sure that no one jumped ship and tried to swim ashore. We didn't want a single Jew making it to the shores of America in 1939. The ship went back to Europe, and many of the people on board were killed. Eleanor heard of this And so she began working behind the scenes to make certain that it never happened again, working tirelessly to help the Jews who were escaping Europe at the time. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Eleanor tried to prevent Franklin from putting American Japanese into internment camps, but failing in that, she visited the camps herself to help set up schools and to provide education and career opportunities for those who were released at the end of the war. During the war, she spoke out against the prevailing Jim Crow laws that kept blacks segregated and in poverty. She insisted that the United States did not have the moral authority to wage war against fascism if we didn't provide civil rights to black Americans. Unless we fully embodied democracy in America, how could we have the moral standing to fight fascism in the rest of the world? After the war, she was the first chairperson of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, and she was the one who oversaw the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's long. I've got a poster-sized copy of it up in our in our sacristy. For her whole life, she worked to fight against racism, against sexism, against religious discrimination. So she was, without a doubt, one of the great luminaries of the 20th century who stood up against the prevailing culture of her day, even to her husband, the longest-serving president in American history. And she helped to shape the New Deal, the formation of the United Nations, and the religiously tolerant and racially diverse nation that we both enjoy and are still trying to get right. But what I find to be paradoxical about this amazing, intelligent, and brave woman, this diplomat, this social reformer, is that she allowed herself to never come out of the closet. Eleanor had a long-term love relationship with the journalist Lorena Hickok. It was not entirely open, but it wasn't terribly well hidden either. For most of her time, their time as lovers, Lorena actually lived in the White House. Their relationship eventually cooled, ironically, because Lorena was thrilled with the large number of lesbians that were in and out of the White House in those days, but she was not happy that Eleanor kept bringing Jews and black people into the White House, and that eventually frosted their relationship. They did remain friends for their lives. You know how we've all got friends or family members that we keep a relationship with in spite of their racism. It just isn't quite the same, is it? It's a bit ironic, though, to be contrasting Eleanor Roosevelt with Auguste Landmesser. Eleanor was a huge historical character. She did so much to deliver the modern world, to help us to come to our senses and to strive to become a decent civilization. And you could say that Auguste was really a nobody. His life was certainly sad, but he died in obscurity. And I don't want to sound judgmental here, but the fact is, Auguste fought for the woman he loved, a Jewish woman that he wasn't allowed to marry. And he was willing to suffer imprisonment and eventually death rather than to pretend that he could discriminate against this woman that he truly loved. Eleanor, on the other hand, fought valiantly for every right cause except for the woman she loved. Mind you, we can all be thankful that Eleanor did not leave Franklin and come out of the closet. She and Lorena could have moved to a country where they could have lived openly in love with each other and lived there comfortably. A part of me thinks that she really should have, and yet without Eleanor, I'm not sure that Franklin Roosevelt would have made terribly moral decisions without her presence constantly calling him to be better than his inclinations were. There were passionate love letters between Eleanor and Lorena. She could describe what it felt like to kiss Lorena in a way that makes me blush, and I'm not easily shocked these days. They had love, they had passion, they shared a bed, a life, and they changed the world's destiny. But they never got to call their relationship what it was. This quote has been falsely attributed to Abraham Lincoln for 100 years now. Abe's not the source. Everybody used to attribute everything they liked to Abraham Lincoln. But I like the saying, if you call a dog's tail a leg, how many legs does a dog have? 4, because calling a tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. I trust that I'm not alone in feeling a real weight of sadness that while Eleanor Roosevelt did so much for us, she did so much for the Jews, she did so much for Black Americans, she did so much to fight the lingering racism against Japanese Americans who were both incarcerated and then robbed by internment. But she never felt safe to say who she was. And I find that to be heartbreaking. Now, in the past, I have come to the conclusion of a sermon about public morality, and I've pointed at the tank man in Tiananmen Square and said, be more like that man. I've applauded the courage of Aisha Evans, who stood up to the riot police in Baton Rouge, or Malala, who was shot in the face for advocating for girls getting to go to school, and she came out of a coma and out of the hospital still advocating for female education. I've pointed at a climate activist, Greta Thunberg, and Nazi resistor, Auguste Landmesser, and I've told you all for years, be more like them. Be more like them. And yet, in spite of all of the amazing things that she accomplished in life, in spite of the indisputable debt of gratitude that we should all feel for the selfless work that Eleanor Roosevelt did, I am tepid about suggesting that we should be more like her. Because I wish that Eleanor had been more fully Eleanor. You feel me? You know what I'm saying? The Jewish psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl said, when we're no longer able to change the situation that we are in, we are challenged to change ourselves. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Do everything that you can to make the world a better place, to bring light into dark places, to bring mercy in place of judgment, to kick at the darkness of prejudice, discrimination, poverty, exploitation, and abuse. I'm just saying, please try to also find a way to live your life fully. Do not be captured by the expectations of others. When I think of all of the great suffering of my own existence, it has almost always been imposed by the condescending judgment of other people. And every time that I've had to deny who I am to be what others expected me to be. And look, guys, I don't know if you all have noticed, but I'm a white male heterosexual. And even I have had to suffer from being imprisoned by the critical expectations of others. Do not let the insincere and the misinformed take away your joy or even force you to deny who you love. If there is someone to whom you might speak of the thrill, as Eleanor did to Hickok, of feeling the northeast corner of your mouth on my lips, you should be proud of that, and you should never cease to be publicly thankful for it.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.